we're sort of live now, but we're just going to wait for a few moments, as we've done before. Probably just wait a couple of minutes for people to join. For those who've already joined, just to say that we are happy to take questions in the Q&A section uh, through the talk, and then I'll field those to Simon as and when they come through. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
perfect. Thank
so
you.
My first appointment as a postdoc in the 90s, I was employed. I got a job working for the Medical Research Council. They had a medical sociology unit at Glasgow University at the time, and I was employed to look at the connection between risk and health from a sociological point of view. And in the 90s, there were, as everyone probably knows, there were a lot of concerns about a so-called epidemic of skin cancer. And so one of the studies we first did was to look at a study of Glaswegian tourists who spent several weeks abroad every year on holiday in sunny locations. And so we wanted to find out what they thought about sun exposure. And what we found was quite interesting. People could both reproduce and they health education advice quite accurately about sun avoidance. They believed it and they found it trustworthy. But on the other hand, they also felt healthier and better about themselves when they exposed themselves to the sun. And they felt better and healthier about themselves when they had a suntan. So this, in many ways, is an extreme contradiction, which needed explaining. It's almost quite unique if you compare it to other so-called, other risks like smoking. Most smokers don't think that smoking is healthy. There might be all sorts of reasons why they can't stop, but they don't think it's healthy. Whereas people actually did think being exposed to the sun was healthy, but they also believed the health education advice. And this contradiction is actually carried over into the health education advice itself. So this is the type of leaflet you might have picked up in a doctor's surgery in this was actually published in the 2010s, around about that time. And this contradiction is carried right through. So it spends a lot of time talking about all the risks of sunlight exposure. There's a little chart here where you can look up your skin type and the UV index and find out how much risk you're at. But then right at the bottom corner, there's a little bit where it starts saying, yes, but we do still need sunlight. We still need to be exposed to sunlight, but it's not really telling us how to actually navigate that particular dilemma. And then it ends up by saying, and some people might need to take vitamin D anyway. So how did we get here? How did our relationship to the sun become so complex? So when I started looking at this research, a colleague suggested looking at the social history of sunlight to see if that would, if you excuse the pun, shed any light on it. So I started looking in detail from a period from around about the end of the 19th century to the mid-20th century. And what I found, which was surprising to me, was a series of dramatic changes in our relationship between sunlight and between our bodies and sunlight. And these dramatic changes have continued right up till today. So let's just go back to the beginning of the story and look at at the end of the 19th century, there were lots of fears about sunlight, both at home and abroad. At the end of the 19th century, sunlight was seen as dangerous and was to be avoided at all costs. So at home, medical journals of the period often frequently talk about a sunstroke and deaths from sunstroke. So this is a fairly typical article. This is from the British Medical Journal of 1896, and it's called Sunstroke at the Seaside, and it talks about the tragic case of a toddler who died after being exposed to the sun. And it ends with this very dramatic flourish. This is but an example of the evil effects of a practice which can be seen in full swing every day at our seaside watering places. Little children paddling with their heads exposed to the blazing sun, no doubt enjoying it, but the danger it involves is very great. Other papers from the period were speculating about what the causes of sunstroke might be. And some suggested that the action of the sun on the human body caused the poisoning of the blood, which was comparable to a snake venom bite. Overseas, there were also other fears about sunlight, and this has to be seen in the context of our colonial possessions at the time, and in particular, the way in which the tropics were viewed with both promise and terror. Promise because of the commodities they offered to us, but also terror in the diseases that were associated with the tropics. And it was thought that sunshine caused most of this ill health. And this centered around the idea of something called tropical neurasthenia, which is a diagnostic category that no longer exists. And it's an amorphous set of symptoms. I'll read out some of these. It says, so these are the type of symptoms that people experiencing tropical neurasthenia might have: irritability, lack of energy, lack of concentration, loss of memory, loss of appetite, headaches, insomnia, diarrhea and other digestive disorders, depression, various phobias, heart palpitation, ulcers, alcoholism, impotence, excessive masturbation by men, frequent or irregular menstrual cycles in women. So a real amorphous set of the symptoms. And some individual doctors then added their own symptoms. So one military physician said that the early symptoms of tropical neurasthenia could be seen if an officer's keeping a perfect bridge score. And to combat this, various protective measures were suggested. So the most obvious of this was the PIF helmet, which can be seen on these soldiers from South Africa. But there was also suggested that there should be metallized inserts put into clothing to protect the spine from sunlight. And the director of the London School of Tropical Medicine also suggested that those people stationed overseas should wear red underwear to protect them from sunlight. So the idea of tropical neurasthenia, which then stopped being a diagnostic category around about the Second World War, and the protective clothing both marked out and medicalized the differences between the colonizer and the colonized. There were also fears about women's exposure to sunlight, and women were told to avoid sunlight at all costs because it might give away undesirable social origins if they have a tan. And so there were lots of advertisements at the time for various bleaching products that women could use to remove any signs of a tan if they accidentally became exposed to the sun. So you can see one of these advertisements here from the Daily Mirror from around about 1915. But despite these fears about
Fantastic.
sunlight, attitudes
Thank you very
at
much
the
for
beginning
time.
of the
Have a great
20th
rest of
century
the
were
day.
beginning to change.
Yeah.
And many of
Thank you
these
very much. Cheers. Take
initial
care. Bye-bye.
changes can be traced to the birth of the outdoors movement. And the outdoors movement was if you like, the romanticization of nature. Nature was seen as pure and was contrasted with the corruption and chaos of cities. So one of the first ways in which this manifested itself was in the advent of camping as a leisure activity. Previously, camping had been more or less completely associated with the military, but this was beginning to change, partly due to the romantic way in which nature became viewed in the romantic literature of the period, but also because of the heroic tales of explorers who'd been using camping. So Thomas Holding published The Cycle and the Camp in 1898. And in this volume, there are frequent references to the benefits of tanning while on a camping holiday. And camping was seen as a way to have a simpler life close to nature. And the tan became a marker of this type of worthy outdoor activities. A similar story could be told about the Boy Scouts movement, and Scouting for Boys was published in 1908. And it was largely based on the idea and fears about the corruption of teenage boys in the city. So this is a picture from the title page, and I don't know if you can see, there's a Boy Scout here navigating towards the sun, which has the word happiness written on it, while avoiding temptation on these rocks. So you can see on one of them, there's a type of woman holding her arms out. There's another person who's drinking. There's some type of dandy standing on one side. I'm not sure what temptation that is. And I presume the person on horseback is gambling. So the idea here was that if it would the idea of scouting boys was based on the idea of muscular Christianity and the idea that exercise, open air exercise in nature would allow boys to avoid temptations that might be apparent in the city. So again, here the suntan became a marker of wholesome worthiness, of people who have engaged in this worthy outdoor activities. So changes in attitudes to sunlight and sunlight exposure also have to be seen in the context of medical developments in the period. And in the period after the start of the 20th century, up until the Second World War, medicine was in a period of transition. On the one hand, there was the old patrician model of medicine, which was in decline. And this was the idea of physicians having private practices, often wealthy private practices, while maybe doing a bit of voluntary work on the side. Within this model, specialism was held in disdain, and there were deep suspicions about instrumentation, laboratory sciences, or the use of statistics in medicine. On the other hand, there was emerging a new model of medicine, a modernist model of medicine, where emphasis was put on the professionalization of the identity, the standardization of training and the state regulation of training, and also increasing specialism, the incorporation of laboratory sciences, particularly biology, into medicine, and the use of statistics was becoming more and more common. And in the pre-Second World War period, both of these existed in tension with each other. But despite the progress that modernization of medicine suggested, there was no particular increase in therapeutic efficiency. So there were various problems, and the most prominent of these was tuberculosis. It had been in decline since the middle of the 18th century. But at the beginning of the 20th century, someone who was diagnosed with tuberculosis, the prognosis was bad, very bad. And tuberculosis held a mercurial hold on the imagination of the period. It was both mysterious and terrifying. And the tension between the old and the new paradigms of medicine allowed a range of alternative treatments for tuberculosis to develop. In fact, there really were only alternative treatments at the time. There was no standardized treatment. Many of the treatments were invasive and extremely painful. So one of the most common treatments at the time was something called artificial pneumothorax. And this involved, if someone had a tubercular lesion on one of their lungs, a hole would be made in their chest cavity to collapse that lung. And anyone who's ever had a collapsed lung knows how painful that can be. Also, the children affected with tuberculosis often led to deformities because it would infect bones. And so often in children's wards, children were stretched using various apparatuses, which were incredibly painful, and they were subjected to repeated operations. One of the other most prevalent ways of treating tuberculosis at this period was the sanatorium cure. This was the idea that those suffering from tuberculosis should retreat to sanatoriums. And the idea behind this was the frenetic pace of modern life, particularly in cities, led to ill health and depressed the immune system. So if people suffering from tuberculosis could be removed to a restful environment, it would allow the body to cure itself. Then added into this was sunlight exposure. And this fitted into the idea of aiding the body to cure itself and was known as heliotherapy. So one of the first proponents of heliotherapy was called Auguste Rollier, and he had several clinics in Leysin in Switzerland. And so you can see here two pictures. There was a children's clinic and there was an adult clinic, which is the lower picture here. And if you just see in the corner there, there's actually two men wearing swimming costumes, wearing skis, so a type of skiing, wearing swimming costumes. And on the other side, you can see children being exposed to sunlight. So this book, which he wrote on heliotherapy, was first published in 1914. It was translated to English in 1923. It was then translated into about 15 other languages, and it went through 7 or 8 republications. So it was a very popular book, and August Rollier became known as the high priest of heliotherapy. And in 1923, a journalist from the Times visited the clinic, and this is the report he wrote in the Times in 1923. The dingy ward, the pale, stricken faces of children, many with the unhealthy beauty of the consumptive, the endless series of operations, the piteous cryings, terrible deformities. Compare that picture to this one, an alpine village sheltering amongst the fragrant pine trees, children, naked, plump and brown as earth itself, playing games or lying, healing in sunlight, laughter, the good laughter of returning health. I mean, and who could argue with that? So through the 20s and 30s, sunlight therapy began to take hold in Britain. And it was used mainly for the treatment of tuberculosis, but also for rickets. So it became increasingly argued in medical papers and textbooks that sunlight was a tonic, which would help the body to cure itself and resist diseases. But it was also argued at the time that this should only be done under the supervision of medical authorities. No one was suggesting at the time that people should just take their clothes off and expose themselves to sunlight willy-nilly. But there were various developments, some of which you can see the pictures here. So one of them was open air schools and the incorporation of sunlights into schools. And here you can see some children in a Manchester school being exposed to sun lamps. This was an exposure that was thought to be prophylactic to prevent disease. In the second picture, you can see the use of sun lamps to treat tubercular lesions on the skin. This form of tuberculosis was known as lupus vulgaris, and was treated by these very, very powerful sun lamp devices, which were actually quite complicated. They were expensive, and they took a lot of training for people to use them effectively. And finally, over to the right-hand side, you can see heliotherapy being practiced at, this was in the Alton Sanatoria. And this is quite interesting because you can see the distinctive architecture of the sanatoria here with large verandas and with buildings with French windows so that patients that could then be wheeled, when there was sunlight, patients could be wheeled out of their rooms or their wards and into the sunlight. It's quite interesting. This model actually then became taken up by hotels. So the idea of the body curing itself and the need for strict medical supervision was prevalent at the time. And many of these ideas fitted into the old patrician model of medicine. And they articulated with something which was common in the pre-war period known as the social hygiene movement. And this was a pre-war movement. And hygiene used here was much broader than we would think of the concept today. Today we think of hygiene just as the avoidance of microbes and cleanliness. But in those days, hygiene actually meant anything that might strengthen the population or a race. And it did have some eugenic overtones as well. And there were even some who argued that sunlight exposure would prevent revolution. But the arguments being established in the medical profession and the use of sunlight to cure things like tuberculosis and to prevent rickets firmly established the idea that sunlight was a tonic that could benefit health. And now it began to be argued that sunlight would benefit all, not just the sick. And there were various developments at the beginning of in the 1920s, which led to this becoming more widespread. And one of the first was the establishment of the Sunlight League in 1924. And the founder of the Sunlight League was a man called Caleb Celebi. There's a picture of him here, good-looking chap. He was actually a physician who trained in Edinburgh, and he set up the Sunlight League, which campaigned for various things. It campaigned for, one of the most prominent things it campaigned was smoke abatement, because they thought that smoke was stopping sunlight reaching cities, and they argued very strongly that the coal should not be used to generate electricity or for home heating. We should move to electricity or hydroelectric. They also argued from other things like the promotion of open air schools. They also argued for mixed bathing, and they also, because at the time, most swimming pools and many beaches were segregated by gender. They also argued for dress reform, particularly amongst swimming costumes, which at the time typically type of stretched from the chest down to the knee, which they argued were both dangerous and unhealthy. And they also had a close relationship to the Men's Dress Reform Party, which was a slightly strange organization in the 20s and 30s, which argued correctly that men's dress was very restrictive at the time. So they also published a journal called Sunlight, and in the first edition of Sunlight, which was published in 1924, they also had their manifesto. They had a copy of their manifesto, which started by saying, "We declare war against the powers of darkness. Smoke and slums must go. Our new houses must be placed so as to receive the sun. We seek to multiply the sources of information and education to such an extent that no man or woman shall be stricken with disease for lack of knowledge of the light that heals. It is ours to better the environment and bring forth a fitter race for humanity's high purposes." Also, there were other developments in the late 20s. There were lots of reports about how sun lamps have been introduced into the London Zoo, into the monkey house at the London Zoo. So here is a fundraising advertisement from the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital saying that, basically saying that if monkeys have got sun lamps, why can't we give them to children as well? And also in 1927, there was a cartoon appeared in the News of the World, which at the time had a circulation of around 3 million people. And this is a picture of a monkey in the monkey house at London Zoo being exposed to sun lamps. And there's a little child at the bars of the window, obviously a slum child, and it's saying, "I wish I was an ape." And in 1928, the Times produced a special edition called the Sunlight and Health Number. And this was a 30-page long special edition of the Times. And it had articles on many aspects of sunlight and sunlight exposure. It had features on spas where you could go to receive sunlight in Europe and in Britain. It had articles on open air culture. There was even an article in there on home decoration and how you could decorate your house to promote sunlight. And in this article, it framed sunlight exposure as a new, exciting science with almost unlimited possibilities. So the Times special edition, in many ways, captured the interest in the health-giving properties of sunlight. And this soon spread to the wider public in the 1920s and 30s. So the desire for strict medical supervision soon gave way. And so I've got a couple of examples of this. One of the first was the invention by Pilkingtons of something called Vitaglass. As many of you probably know, normal glass blocks UV rays, but Vitaglass was designed to allow UV rays to pass through. And in 1926, a press conference was held in London Zoo. I mentioned London Zoo about 3 times in this talk. But in 1926, the press conference was held in London Zoo because Vitaglass had been fitted into a number of the animal houses. And this press conference was a time used to argue that Vitaglass should also be fitted in schools and hospitals. And here you can see type of various images of mainly children lying out in the sunlight, which is allowed to pass through these new Vitaglass windows. Also in the press at the time, there became numerous articles for sun lamps, which people could use at home without medical supervision. So this one's for Neurovitalux. And again, even the name Vitalux captures the idea that the sunlight is a tonic which would benefit people. And so it uses the type of strapline, sunshine, even on dull days. And it says here, to modern science and technique, we owe the idea of producing for mankind a similar effective artificial source of radiation to compensate for the lack of sunshine, which is felt particularly in our latitudes. Also in the 20s and 30s, various advertisements appeared for vitamin D products. Edward Mellanby had had been working on the role of micronutrients in human health, micronutrients which later became called vitamins. And he discovered the role of vitamin D, and how it was produced. And then there was a lot of interest in vitamin D. And so this one for Radisol is quite interesting because the strapline here is the scientific substitute for sunshine. And the name Radisol here refers to the new science of radiation. And again, in the pre-war period, radiation was generally regarded very positively. I mean, you probably wouldn't give a product that similar name today. So by the late 20s, the connection between sunlight and health was appearing in various places, but it also began to be incorporated into the built environment. So one of the first examples of this was the Garden City movement. So here's an advertisement from the 1920s for Welwyn Garden City. So it reads, yesterday, living and working in the smoke. Today, living in the suburbs, working in the smoke. Tomorrow, living and working in the sun at Welwyn Garden City. So the idea of a Garden City movement was suggested originally by Ebenezer Howard in the late 19th century. And it was the idea of organic communities that were independent of existing cities and towns. It was a new form of community, which was neither country or city, but a hybrid of the best bits of both. Letchworth was the first garden city, and work began on it in around 1904. And the architects who designed Letchworth Garden City were Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker, and these were known as the Sunshine Architects. And in their plans for Letchworth Garden City, they stipulated that no property should ever be in the shadow of another property. And they designed houses to maximize sunlight into the interior. And they argued that the sun should follow the daily activities of the occupants. So when people got up in the morning and drew their curtains, they should see the sun rising. And when they had their evening meal in the evening, they should look out the windows and see the sun setting. Another development in the 1930s was the Lido movement, which became prevalent in Britain, but also throughout Europe. And these were open air swimming pools. And they were partly a response to the newly emerging idea of leisure activity and increasing amounts of free time that workers had. But they were more than just swimming pools. They also had areas around them where people could sunbathe, where there were deck chairs, where there were cafes. And this contrasted with the existing swimming pools of the period, which were very type of athletic. They were often strictly segregated by gender. The Lidos, on the other hand, allowed mixed bathing, and they were the first time that people could actually see a display of the partially clothed body within the city. People described them as a promiscuous democracy, as sunlight and pleasure began to be linked. People could go to the Lidos, lie out in the sun, and they could have fun. It became a liminal zone, a slightly anarchic liminal zone, where people could have fun while exposing themselves to the sun. And the final development was various health centres are open. There was the Peckham Health Centre, and I'm using here the example of the Finsbury Health Centre, which was designed by Berthold Lebekin, who also designed some of the animal houses at the London Zoo. This is the last time I'm mentioning London Zoo. And it was designed so that no matter what time of the year or what time of the day, if there was any sun available, it will penetrate the building. And the Finsbury Health Centre was built in one of the poorest areas or neighbourhoods in London. It had general practitioners, it had a TB clinic, it had a dental clinic, and it had a solarium. And on the walls were written slogans like these: fresh air day and night, live outdoors as much as you can. There's also images of the sun on the walls, images of the sun on the walls. And you can see the solarium in the entrance of the solarium in the corner. So the pre-port period had established the idea of sunlight as healthy and sun exposure as something that was pleasurable. So adverts in the post-war period began to play on this. Sunlight was pleasure and it was also sensual. So you can see this in the 1950s advertisements: take more sun, get more tan. In the 70s, overseas mass tourism really began to take off. And this was largely driven by a desire to get the sun, by a desire to have 2 weeks of guaranteed sunlight when you went on your holiday. So the last picture on this slide is the 1990s, when things began to change yet again. This was the peak period of fears about sunlight exposure and the very famous slip, slap, slop campaign. Slip on a hat, slip on a t-shirt, slap on a hat, slop on sunscreen. So this is the idea that sunlight was to be avoided at all costs. And if you couldn't avoid it, you were to protect yourself against it. So this advertisement plays into that quite cleverly, because this was the time also of the first HIV epidemic, where we've been told to practice safe sex. So here, the idea was you can still have pleasure in the sun as long as you use protection, in the same way that you can still have pleasure with sex as long as you use protection. But then there was a final change, and this was in 1999, and it was an article published by the British Medical Journal in July 1999. It was actually published on the hottest day of the year. I mean, the British Medical Journal is a bit of a tabloid in the sense of they know when to put articles out. So it was published on the hottest day of the year, and it was written by four of Britain's most prominent epidemiologists of the period. And what they said in this was, once they looked at the epidemiology of sun avoidance, was that sure, it reduced skin cancer, but overall mortality had increased. So the press at this point had a field day about this. So this is the typical type of headline from the Telegraph, but there are loads of other headlines as well. It's sunbathing is healthy, say experts. And this, even Private Eye ran an article on this. And this is the sun good for you after all? And this actually isn't an article about sun exposure. It's about Tony Blair and his relationship to the Sun newspaper. But I suppose our final thought is that our relationship to sunlight is highly complex and it's dynamic and it's always changing. And in many ways, the constant changes have left people uncertain about what the right course of action is with sunlight exposure. So that's where I really want to finish right now. And I suppose just ask if there's any questions or any comments.
So I'm gonna jump in, Simon, and say thank you very much. Fascinating presentation and really interesting to understand the shifts that have happened in a sociological sense in terms of our relationship with the sun. And yeah, when I read the book, I was quite amazed. I hadn't really associated it so much, but when through the sort of colonization period, and if I've got this right. The higher you were in society, the whiter your skin was. The tan was seen to be um, a sort of a sign of lower class in a certain sense. So we've made a really massive shift. And if we consider also, I mean, what the dangers must have been for skin bleaching to avoid what is a sort of a natural process is quite amazing. I'll need to remember the bit about red underwear. I don't think I own any, and maybe I need to go and get some. But yeah, that's something slightly different. But so when we talked with Richard Weller back in January, I think Richard Weller as a dermatologist, um, you know, he's looking at the correlation between exposure to, let's say, the full solar spectrum and mortality. And from what his research suggests, using the UK Biobank, is that the more time we spend in the sun, the longer we live, quite frankly. And I think there's a note somewhere that you mentioned about our sort of daily lives in offices, and actually it's smokers who are finding the time to go and spend time outdoors when non-smokers might not do so. Maybe there is a benefit to smoking somewhere, maybe not in certain senses. But yeah, when we spoke to sort of Richard Weller, he was saying, science has a way of correcting itself, and yeah, the interesting thing I find in what you've been sort of saying is that 100 years or so ago, it seems that we knew more about light and sunlight than maybe we do today. We've somehow been brainwashed, and I don't know. Maybe that's a question in a certain sense. Do you think or what do you think has shifted our opinions to move from a position 100 years ago where we understood sunlight um, as a healer to today where we're sort of almost everyone is, whether we like it or not, makeup products, skincare products have, some form of sort of sun cream type or sun protection within them. Have we shifted from knowing quite a lot to actually not knowing a lot at all?
Um, well, I think there's several ways of answering that. I think it's interesting at the moment that there is some potentially exciting research about which you referred to with your previous talk about speaker. But there is some interesting research about emerging about the role of sunlight on health, and in particularly the role of vitamin D in a number, because everyone knows that there's good evidence of the benefits of vitamin D for protecting bones and increasing immunity, but there's a lot of other suggested relationships with vitamin D that stretch for anything from cancer prevention to preventing diabetes, mental health, cardiovascular health. A lot of these are just suggested, and there's not solid evidence for them at the moment, but there's even a suggestion that the efficacy of supplements are not as good as vitamin D produced within the body. And there's various reasons for that. I mean, a biologist did explain how vitamin D is produced in the body, but it is an incredibly complex process which involves several stages. And the argument is that vitamin D, if you take it as a supplement, doesn't really have the same mechanism as if you produce your own vitamin D through sunlight exposure. So those are some interesting things. I think one of the other things is, I go back to my original Glasgow tourists. They both thought sunlight was healthy, but they also thought it was a risk. And I think that's probably where most people are these days, despite what you're told from health promotion, is that most people think that some degree of sunlight exposure is healthy, but overexposure can be risky. The problem is that it's no really easy way to actually manage that type of manage that balance. So I think there was some real negative effects of the campaigns from the 90s when we were basically being told to avoid all sun. And now the sun advice has been modified slightly, as I showed from that slide from the 2010s. But it is also it's a way in which people reading that can dismiss it all because they say, well, you're just telling me two different things at the same time and not really giving me any clear steer on which one I should be adhering to. So people just probably ignore it and do their own thing, which is not good. I mean, so I think things are changing, but it would be good if health promotion was more realistic in the way they addressed those changes. I don't know if that answers your question or
So,
not,
so
but
sort of answer, yeah, I think it does. I think it does. Yeah, and yeah, coming back to Richard Weller, and his research, you mentioned cardiovascular health. His research, suggests that, or yeah, some of his studies, you know, that vitamin D is yes an important part of important element for our health, but it is actually also a biomarker for time spent outdoors. And in terms of the cardiovascular side, what we learned from Richard Weller is that UV coming into the skin releases nitric oxide, which then finds its way into the blood vessels, which dilates the blood vessels, lowers blood pressure. There are mechanisms within our physiology which we maybe don't think enough about, but yeah, vitamin D in that sense is a sort of a biomarker
mm,
for the amount of time spent outdoors. And similarly through COVID, there was or there were some thoughts that actually the more vitamin D you had in your system, the
mm,
less likely, or the less impacted you'd be from COVID. Actually, that seems to have shifted the other way to suggest that, yeah, again, vitamin D was just a biomarker, and it was the amount of time we spent outdoors. And in that particular case, if I'm not wrong, it's the long wavelengths of light which was stimulating mitochondrial function to fight back against sort of COVID itself. So
mm,
just really interesting. But whether it's from a sociological side or from a sort of a dermatological side, it seems that there's a similar trend coming out now, which
mm,
is actually sunlight exposure, sensible sunlight exposure, we should say,
mm,
is very valid. So coming back to the late also the early sort of 20th century, when we had the heliotherapy. Um, that sort of died down. Do you think that's sort of as a consequence of finding things like antibiotics? Did that sort of
yeah. I
kill
mean,
kill, kill, kill the heliotherapy movement?
yeah. Well, there's several things. One is that heliotherapy, for all its promises, wasn't really a cure for tuberculosis. I mean, most people, even in Rolliers sanatorium, most people who went there came out dead. Um,
Okay.
I mean, I've actually visited his clinic, which is now, interestingly, a tourism college, which I think is another transition that happened. A lot of those sanatoria did turn into hospitals, were hospitals, and then they turned into hotels. But I've been, and they actually had two stations there, one which was for patients arriving, and the other one was for coffins leaving. So that the two never saw each other. Um, but 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 I think the point was that it did establish the idea that sunlight was healthy, and it then, I think, also established the idea that that the role of vitamin D in actually preventing disease. And I've also interviewed a number of TB doctors who practice these days, and a lot of them say they just say, "Yeah, I take high doses of vitamin D every day," because they think it will stop them getting from tuberculosis. So there was something in it. It just wasn't quite enough. So the sanatorium sun cure and heliotherapy died out after the invention of streptomycin and the combination antibiotic therapies that were then used to treat tuberculosis. I mean, now we're in the situation where a lot of those treatments are stopping to work because of resistance to tuberculosis. And also, heliotherapy hasn't really died out everywhere. I had a Egyptian PhD student a few years ago, and she was telling me that heliotherapy is still really a major type of thing that's practiced in Egypt. Um, I also had a colleague who visited India, and he said there's still heliotherapy sanatoria in existence there. So it still is used widely in a variety of other places, and it still is pretty much used in a, I'm sure your dermatologist will know about this, but there are a variety of health conditions where heliotherapy is still used to treat various skin conditions. And it is the only treatment for a number of skin conditions is light therapy.
I think psoriasis is one of those, isn't it?
Yeah,
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 and during the winter, I've understood that those who suffer from psoriasis, if they go to a tanning salon or sunbed, then actually that helps give some relief, and that's
yeah,
down to
yeah,
the obviously
yeah.
the ultraviolet aspect of it. And I'm wondering, with heliotherapy, has it maybe died down as sun tourism grew, and actually sun tourism has sort of stayed with us one way or another,
Well,
and back in the day, tourism wasn't there. Then heliotherapy started, then sun tourism sort of followed suit, and we've not let go of sun tourism in a certain sense.
yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I was hinting at when I talked about the architecture of sanatoria is there's a real correspondence between sanatoria practices and tourism practices. They both involve going somewhere and spending a lot of time doing nothing and exposing yourself to the sun. Even the architecture of the venues, and as I said, a lot of the sanatoria turned into hotels because the architecture is so similar. They had big windows where you can easily expose yourself to the sun. I mean, also a lot of the places that in the 19th century and the earlier 20th century, a lot of the places that people went for the sun cure, which would be south of France, Switzerland, um, the Italian Riviera. These are all places that are now tourist destinations. And at the time, there's actually letters in the British Medical Journal from the period of the 1920s where they're complaining that hotels were no longer taking tuberculosis patients because the the users of casinos were far more profitable. So so they were complaining that TB patients could no longer get into hotels in places like Menton and Nice because they found that actually casino clients were far more profitable customers. So but there was a big correspondence between the tourism sector and the sanatoria sector. And as I said, the Rolliers Clinic in Switzerland has now become a tourism college.
Interesting. And I mean, we talk about it quite a lot these days, but if you're European, you spend 90% of your time indoors. If you're American, you're probably spending 93% of your time indoors. If you're in the Middle East, potentially you're spending 96% of your time indoors. Um, yeah, Surely at some point that we'll find that that disconnect from you know a, a sort of a source of light, which is for want of a better term, ultimately pretty healthy, as long as
Mm,
as long as we practice it sensibly.
mm.
Um, yeah, what yeah what impact are we going to go back to the days of rickets and TB, that lack of exposure to light, or is that something or are we going to
Well,
see something different, do you think?
I think that's an interesting question. I think there's I think it reminds me when you, I mean, definitely there have been cases of rickets already reported
Okay.
in the UK. And I think it raises something which you mentioned earlier about the COVID pandemic and about how vitamin D was a marker of how much time people had spent outside. And I think this was really apparent in the COVID epidemic. There was a real inequality of of how people could expose themselves to the outside, because if you lived in a flat somewhere, you probably you were allowed out half an hour a day, whereas if you lived in a house that had a garden, you could spend all day in the garden, really, and probably a lot of people did because there was nothing else to do. So again, it became a marker almost of an inequality in access to sunlight, access to daylight. And I think that is one of the issues which people like yourselves and architects need to think seriously about, how we can readdress those inequalities that might exist for sunlight exposure. And also, we also need to consider various occupations where people are working in environments where they might go to work when it's dark in the morning, particularly during the winter. They might go to work where it's dark and they might leave when it's still dark. So you never see any sunlight at all. Shift workers as well. People who work in call centers. These are all people who might find any type of daylight exposure really difficult. And that has all sorts of, it's not just about vitamin D, but there's all sorts of health effects which stem from that, about mental health as well as physical health. So I think this is a real issue that we need to start taking seriously.
Yeah, and I think architecture and design in particular have a huge role to play. You know, a really huge role to play. And with the amount of time we spend indoors today, I think it was Winston Churchill who was quoted as saying, we shape our buildings thereafter they shape us. And I
Mm,
think with the amount of time we spend indoors now, I think there's probably not a truer statement really, in what the outcome is. So if the input is a design based around human health, and we talked with Ty Farrow last month, who is a salutogenic specialist, someone who designs based on salutogenesis as opposed to pathogenesis, so looking to create health. And his perspective, which was really interesting, is the do no harm
mm,
statement for him. It doesn't go far enough. Do no harm is too neutral. We need we
mm.
need to we need to do better. We need to deliver health.
Do good.
And architecture can play a huge part of that. And clearly, light has an impact. One of the challenges that I think we've got today is that we've got a restriction in the lighting world, and the restriction is a legislative one, not a technological one. We can design light fittings with sort of a health a healthier spectral distribution, but we're limited by legislation currently, and we don't necessarily then think about what the long-term cost is running further on down the line. I mean,
Mm,
every year we hear the NHS is just you know crumbling under certain weights. Maybe we should be spending a little bit more upfront
mm.
to reduce certain aspects coming down the line.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that. And again, I think, as you hinted at earlier, in the 1920s and 30s, this was being thought about seriously by people like the designers of the Garden City movement, um, by designers of health centers. Um, and I'm sure it is being thought about now, but it seemed to be at the time they thought this was part of progress, and that seemed to have been lost for some of the post-war period. That seems to have been lost. Um,
And I'm going to say something that might sound what's the word, anti-sustainability in a planetary sense, but I'm not against sustainability in a planetary sense. But I think as a consequence of a very defined drive towards environmental sustainability in the built environment, I think potentially we've sort of forgotten somewhat about human sustainability, and what the human needs. And really interesting to see that at London Zoo, they were giving the apes better quality of light, let's say, than they were giving to people who are unwell.
Mm,
Similarly, when we look at light today and the lighting of plants, we give plants an energetic value to light, for their productivity, so that they deliver greater yields. Yet for humans, we've limited light to our understanding of light. We've limited it now to something for vision, and
mm,
yet there's all sorts of processes that happen beyond that. So I do find it quite interesting, and I think we sort of almost, as I say, have forgotten about what humans might need.
mm, mm. I mean, and also, just the design of the type of Parker and Unwin's design of houses that just thought about where people got up and when they went to bed and how they would actually see daylight in that process. And I think a lot of the post-war urban developments um, tended to ignore that to a certain extent. Obviously the development of tower blocks and things like that completely ignored that. But even in the suburban developments, which type of refer to aspects of the Garden City movement in that they type of they take some aspects of it, but they seem to have forgotten about the daylight aspect of it and about the importance of incorporating daylight into people's houses.
Yeah, which is phenomenally important. Of
Mm,
course, today we've also reduced it even further with things like low E glass as well. So it's not just
mm,
lighting; it's the glazing that has an
mm.
impact too. Um, So I don't know if anyone, I know you and I, Simon, are chatting away here. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Let me just see if we do have a question here. You mentioned how sunlight has previously tied to social status and colonial beauty standards. Do you feel these connections still exist? And if so, how are they evolving? And is there some connection between building design, social status, and light? For example, access to spaces with large windows and better quality of light may be related to better economic status. So maybe let's tackle the first question, which is, mentioning about social status and colonial beauty standards. Do you feel these connections still exist? And if so, how are they evolving?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I think they still exist and they're evolving in a quite a different way. So there's there's already, I think, you can discern people arguing about different types of tan. So if I go on a walking holiday in Switzerland and come back with a nice golden tan, that's seen as a good worthy thing in the traditional way. Whereas if some people who got too much of a tan, it's seen as inauthentic or type of it still is giving away um, undesirable social origins for some people. If you have too deep a tan or it's too, people say, oh, that's an artificial tan because it's been on a sunbed. So there still is quite a lot of discrimination about the particular way in which people are exposing themselves to sunlight. Some ways are seen as worthy, and some ways are seen as less worthy. And I think that still does play quite an important role in I suppose in the aesthetics of beauty and the aesthetics of the way in which we present ourselves in a particular way. Um, so yeah, I'd say, and that process is quite dynamic and is still evolving. So that is, it will be changing, but it is the suntan is seen as a marker of various things, and it still is used as a marker of various things.
Not to take this conversation political, but is Trump's tan worthy or not worthy? You don't
It
need to
would.
answer that one, Simon. You don't need to answer that one.
Well, I think that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, um, it was interesting when I was talking about the Tony Blair thing at the end of the 90s. I don't know if you remember that at the end of the 90s, there was a whole period where Tony Blair was known as Teflon Tony because nothing would touch him. And the tabloids were desperately trying to find something to have on him. And one of the things they struck upon was, had he been using an artificial sun lamp in number 10? And there were a number of tabloid features were calling him Tanny Blair and stuff like that. So again, in that context, it was seen as a mark of his inauthenticity.
Authenticity.
Yeah, and I think the type of the orange narcissist is also, I mean, it's also seen as a type of a marker of
Authenticity.
inauthenticity, which I
Yeah,
think is is still one of the most significant markers of the type of town. If it's seen as inauthentic, it's seen as unworthy.
right. Very, very nicely answered. Thank you. So just going on to the second part of that question. Um, is there some connection between building design, social status, and light? For example, access to spaces with large windows and better quality of light may be related to better economic status.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, you only have to think of the type of, looking at those California houses on the coast, which cost when some of them are burnt down now, but which cost millions and millions of dollars, and they have enormous great picture windows, and then you compare that to people living in deprived areas in cities where they've probably got very little access to daylight, if at all. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's having large picture windows is still a marker of status. Um, and it still allows the occupants of those particular buildings to have more access to daylight than other people.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true, and we see. Yeah, if we look at tower blocks as an example, the access to daylight is pretty limited.
Mm,
And
yeah.
yeah, that definitely has an impact. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. If you have, please feel free to post them into the Q&A. Um, and so yeah, question for you, in the meantime, Simon, do you have any personal routines or habits related to sunlight exposure that you follow?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in winter, I try, if there's any bit of sunlight available, I try to go for a walk in it. And I'm lucky enough to have the type of job where I can, I'm responsible for managing my own time, and I can do that quite easily. Um, so, and I also do take vitamin D during the winter and into the spring. Um, Yes, I mean, I think particularly for us in the northern climes, we do have a deficit of sunlight in the winter, so it's just important to take advantage of any chance you get to go out into it, even if it's
Mm,
only a few minutes. I think that still makes a big difference, definitely
yeah.
to my mental health anyway.
No, absolutely, and I have to say that this winter in particular, I've made a point of going for a walk after lunch. Just maybe a mile around the block, to get some light in my eyes for one. Um, the Yeah, during the winter, I'm in before it gets light. I'm home generally, heading home, after dark.
Mm,
So just to get some light
mm,
is better than nothing. Um, and look, so the work that Glenn Jeffrey's been doing, he's been looking at how exposure to long wavelengths of light reduces or can help to reduce blood glucose levels. Going out for a walk is going to help to do that. So there
mm,
are, let's say, biological reasons, potentially there as well. So
mm.
yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think, there is some pleasure to be had in just going out for a walk
Yeah,
in the
definitely.
daylight. So
Yeah, and having sunlight strike your face is pleasurable
yes.
any time of the year. Yeah,
And especially this last weekend, I think we all had it good, and
yeah,
feeling the warmth from the sun was really quite wonderful.
yeah.
So we've got another question here. Given the historical context, what lessons can modern architects learn from past approaches to maximizing sunlight in buildings, and what older technologies might be worth revisiting?
Well, I think I already touched upon this in when I was talking about the sunlight architects and the way in which they design houses. And again, I mean, you have to be realistic about that. That's probably not going to be possible for every new development to design houses like that, because obviously, if you want every building to not be in the shadow of any other, it's type of, you need quite a lot of space for those type of things. But I mean, again, there was, I think. in the 1930s, the Royal Society of Architects published a paper about the design of buildings to maximize sunlight. And they had a lot of very, very type of complicated formulas in there about how, because it's not just as simple as designing a building so it faces, it faces south, because obviously the sun moves around during the day. So they had a lot of complicated formula about what type of building was it and how can you maximize sunlight for that particular advantage. So I think it's, I mean, I'm not familiar with current architecture, so I don't know how much this is something which is thought about, but it seems that sometimes daylight is not really, or how to allow the maximum amount of daylight into a building is something which isn't or hasn't been always considered.
I think one of the challenges within the modern built environment as well is now things like thermal heat gain, which limits what you can do. I mean, you can still have a reasonable amount of glass, but that glass is going to be coated, and then
Yeah.
as a consequence of that, it's doing very much what we've got with artificial light sources today, which is delivering visible light, but not delivering the other aspects which are positive. Yeah, Khurshid has posted a question. Are there specific wavelengths of sunlight that may benefit health more than are more or have healing properties?
Yeah, that's kind of out. I mean, I'm a medical sociologist, so I mean that's slightly out of my area of expertise. But I think some of your previous speakers did cover some of this in quite a lot of detail. Um, so I think different wavelengths of sunlight have different health effects. I think that's accurate, isn't it? So
Yes, this.
the the red do particular things, whereas the blues do other things. So yeah,
Yeah.
but that's about as much as I know about it.
So Khurshid, I can share with you some wavelength information that Martin Morreed put together. Martin Morreed, who's a circadian scientist in the States, has been pushing back quite strongly against a ruling by the Department of Energy, or yeah, I think it's Department of Energy in the States, saying that by 2028, all retrofit LED light sources need to have a minimum or deliver a minimum of 125 lumens per watt, which means that basically, again, we're going to sacrifice quality of light for energy efficiency. And so he wrote a petition to push back against that. And within that paper, he makes quite clear what different wavelengths are doing, both in the invisible and the visible part of the spectrum. So Khurshid, I can send you some of that information. Um, if there are no other questions, maybe some closing thoughts from your side, Simon. What message do you think, or do you hope readers of your might take away from your book?
I think just the message I ended on, which is our relationship to sunlight is complex and it's dynamic. It changes all the time, and we just need to be wary of those changes and see where they're changing, and also try to be more accommodating for where people actually are in their lives, and make more allowance for where people are in their lives when we're both designing health education materials, but also designing other things like buildings.
No, fantastic. And then maybe one last question, really. Are there any upcoming projects or research you're excited about?
Well, over the last few years, I've been distracted by various other projects which I've been working on. So I did a project recently on digital health, and I did some other ones on biosecurity. But I'm hoping now that's all over, and I've just got to the end of a cycle of teaching production. At the OU, we have intensive teaching production where we produce all our teaching materials in one go, and then it tiles off. I'm hoping to get back to the sunlight research, and I want to really look in more detail at the post-war period. And I'm quite interested in looking at how various things emerged, like things that we all take for granted now, which aren't really for granted. Things like, where did the SPF factor come from? Where did the UV index come from? How are these things related to health information that we're putting out there, and how are they met? Also, what's the relationship between tourism and people's ideas about sun exposure, which I think again is an important thing. So I think there's various other things that I'm quite interested in the post-war era about sunlight and sunlight exposure, which I'm hoping to get back to fairly soon.
You mentioned digital health. Do you mind just expanding a little bit on that?
Well, it was more about how people use digital devices to track their exercise routines. And so we concentrated on walking and cycling. And we published a paper on that, on walking and cycling, and how people use digital devices to monitor that. But there is also an aspect of that about sunlight exposure as well, because people at the moment, there are a number of wearable devices which are either being designed or you can purchase, which do actually monitor in real time your exposure to sunlight, so that you know when you're overexposing and when you're in the type of healthy zone, which I think could be quite useful. I mean, but they're likely to be quite expensive. So again, it will raise inequalities in how people access that type of stuff. But there might be potential there for something which is quite useful for people.
So I don't know if you're aware, there's an app called DMinder, and DMinder was developed by Dr. Michael Hollick as a sort of a way of estimating your vitamin D
Right,
synthesis, which is very interesting and actually gives you a quite clear indication of your sunlight exposure, and if you've had too much or
right.
whatever, and it geolocates you so that you can understand what your UV index is locally, and you put in aspects of what your skin type is, your body weight, and so on and so forth, and height, and so on and so forth, so that it then estimates your production of vitamin D. When you mentioned digital health, I did wonder whether it was actually I wasn't imagining what you were going to tell me. I was actually wondering whether sort of health related to digital use of digital devices and apps and that sort of stuff. So because that again, I see this aspect of life where we are connected, constantly in front of screens. Maybe not out so much. So maybe even the digital health devices or apps like Strava and that sort of stuff keep you somehow. Maybe there's a good side and a bad side. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean that's the type of the conclusion we came to. Strava's got a good side and a bad side, and some of the bad side is pretty bad actually, and some of the good side is actually pretty good. But I mean, again, it's a type of question of balancing how those things intermesh. I mean, after I did the research, I actually deactivated my Strava account because I thought actually the bad side was probably more prevalent for me than the good
The good
side,
side.
because it was encouraging me to do quite dangerous things, to beat type of time segments and stuff like that. So I decided that's probably not a good idea when you're on the road.
Yeah, no, I know the push that Strava gives. Um, so Simon, listen, I want to thank you very much for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating. Yeah, it's a very different look at light and sunlight. We've not explored the sociological aspect to it, but really fascinating to hear how things have evolved, and
Mm,
how we sort of got to where we got to, and let's see where we go.
mm,
Hopefully with the support of dermatologists like Richard Weller,
mm,
putting the message out that sun, maybe it's time for a rethink.
mm.
Is a good thing.
Yep. Yep, that's a great message to end on, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you
Okay,
very much for your time.
thanks
Have
a
a
lot,
great
and
rest
thanks
of the
everyone
day.
for coming and watching.
Yeah, thank
Bye.
you very much. Cheers. Take care. Bye bye bye. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Oh no,
Let's
thanks
let's
for
stay in
inviting
touch.
me.
Fantastic. Thank you
Okay,
very much for your time.
thanks
Have
a
a
lot,
great
and
rest
thanks
of the
everyone
day.
for coming and watching.
Yeah. Thank
Bye.
you very much. Cheers. Take care. Bye bye bye.